Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. I am delighted to be joined by Jorge Marti. He's the Secretariat of Heads of Venezuela. Thank you for joining us, Jorge.
It's a pleasure, as always, to be with you.
In the world today, one thing that we have lost sight of in the noise of war is the war against the workers. Now, France is putting the struggle in visibility again. Can we talk a little bit about the strikes, the marches, the people's upheaval in France against the yet another cut to the workers' rights?
This movement has now been going on for several months. It started really on the 19th of January, after the government of Macron, which is a very weak government that has barely a parliamentary majority, to attempt once again to cut the pension rights that the French workers have won over many years. And in this case, they wanted to increase retirement age by 2 years to 64. And in many European countries, workers would be happy to retire at 64. Retirement age has now been pushed back in most of the countries. But in France, this was the last straw in a long line of attacks against pension rights, which goes back to 1995-96, when they wanted to destroy the pension systems for the railway workers, and there was a 3-month-long strike. And so the movement started on the 19th of January, and it followed a pattern of calling the unions calling for a big day of action, in which there will be strikes in a whole number of sectors. Then another day of action, perhaps 2 or 3 weeks later, then another day of action. And it reached a point where many workers couldn't see that this was a winning strategy. And these days of actions were becoming weaker with less participation. But then about 4 weeks ago, the government couldn't get a parliamentary majority for the pensions reform, and they decided to use decree powers under Article 49(3) of the Constitution, which allows the president, in certain occasions, to avoid parliamentary vote. And they use this power to pass this very unpopular law. When I say that this law is very unpopular, it has the opposition of 80% of the population and 92% of workers, i.e. people who are in employment currently. So it's an extremely unpopular law. And the fact that the government resorted to decree powers, emergency undemocratic powers, to avoid a parliamentary vote that they thought they were going to lose, weren't sure that they could get it passed, then this led to an explosion of anger. For the first time, the youth started to participate in the movement with faculty occupations, mass assemblies, and street demonstrations. Where for a period of maybe 10 days, there were daily spontaneous demonstrations in Paris and in dozens of other cities across the country, protesting against this front on democracy. And many people were now saying, which is not just a question of defending pension rights, but we want to take back everything that's been taken away from us for the last 20 or 30 years. And so instead of a dynamic of 1 day of action every 2-3 weeks, you had a developing general strike with some sections like the refuse collector, the workers, sanitation workers in the big cities going on strike. Some of them have been out for 4 weeks. Then the oil refinery and oil depot workers also going on strike. Even workers at the nuclear power stations, workers in the big museums, in the Eiffel Tower. And this was a developing general strike, which is still continuing today. And tomorrow there's going to be another one of these big days of action. And I'm sure many of the big cities and most of the public services and private companies are going to be paralyzed, either by the direct action of strikers in the workplaces or by road blockades and so on. A huge oil tanker was prevented from being unloaded at the port of Dunkirk by the dockers. Similar situation in other ports around the country. The main airports in Paris are starting to feel a lack of fuel for the planes. And so the whole situation has become a massive explosion of anger, to which the government has responded with more repression. These spontaneous demonstrations show police brutality, the arrest of hundreds of people for no particular reason. And then the government tried to use emergency powers also to force workers back to work in a number of key refineries. But this became like a game of cat and mouse. The judge will order the back to work legislation for a number of workers in a particular refinery. Then the police will turn up at the houses and take them to work. They will have to cross a massive picket line, riot police involved and everything. Once they finally were forced back into work, they couldn't do anything because the gates of the refinery were blockaded by striking workers, and nothing could go in or out. Also, for instance, the energy workers have been using the power to cut off the electricity from the headquarters of a number of big companies, from the bosses, employers' organization headquarters, and so on. And what you can see really is the power of the working class. Nothing moves in modern society without the kind permission of workers. Workers make everything run. But in most times, they're not aware of their own power. Now, I don't know how this movement in France is going to end. The government seems decided not to retreat. They had a meeting today with the trade union leaders. They were invited to the presidential palace to talk for talks, but they were told that there was no chance of changing this pensions counter-reform. So at the same time, there has been another interesting development, which is the Congress of the CGT, the main trade union, the General Confederation of Labor, where a strong left wing has emerged, which is questioning the tactics of the leadership, these tactics of isolated days of action. And they're saying that what we should do is a general strike, an all-out general strike involving all sectors of production. We need to build for that. That's the only way, not only to force the government back on this question, but also to start reclaiming some of the rights that have been taken away from us in the last period. At the end of the day, what's being posed in France today, and this movement, is who rules the country. A government that is extremely unpopular, can't even get a parliamentary majority, or the street, the mass demonstrations and strikes, which have the support of the majority of the population. How do you call that democracy? A government that's isolated, against the ropes, can't even get a parliamentary majority? That's not what people voted for. In fact, very few people voted for this government. That's the problem they have.
I feel that you make a very important point, is that we forget how much power we as workers have when we're united. When we're divided and competing for the lowest wage, well, we can be taken down quite easily. But when we stand together, it's a different story. It really reminds me of so many of the struggles in Latin America, and the multiple months of strikes, in Colombia and Chile, just in the recent years. So I feel that what the government says ultimately will be determined by what the people do, and so if the people continue to stand united, I see some victories coming. But I also want to ask you, part of the problem is we have lost that ability to self-educate and remember our own histories. How this pensions, the rights to pensions were won, the deep struggle that it took for that to take place. It's not that benevolent government suddenly said, you know what, you work really hard, you deserve to retire. So let's talk a little bit about that collective history that we must keep alive, and where else, we need to remember that this has never gone away. There are other parts in this world where people continue to struggle against great barriers and repression.
it's interesting you mentioned this because just a few days ago, we commemorated the anniversary of the introduction of the 8-hour working day in Spain, which was in 1919. But this took place after a huge strike in Catalonia, which started as a strike of a Canadian company, actually. It was called the Canadian. It was a power company that generated electricity for most of Catalonia. There was a small incident with some office workers were sacked, and then the union decided to strike. And the union was the CNT, which had been just created at that time. It was a new type of unionism. It wasn't craft unionism, but industrial unionism. And this was a test of strength for this new trade union organization. The workers in the Canadian power company in Barcelona, in Spain, were solid out on strike, but then they started to get solidarity from other sections of the working class. And finally, the movement developed by week 3, developed into an all-out general strike by the whole of the Catalonian working class, which was very developed at that time. And not only the workers beat back the attempt of the company to sack these workers in the offices of the company, but also, as a result of this, the fact that the strike became more general, the government was forced to concede, to introduce a law for the 8-hour working day. So, I mean, even that, his basic demand, was won by mass struggle. Now, of course, in the period after the Second World War, capitalism's experienced a period of maybe 25 or 30 years of upswing. And it was easier to win concessions at that time. For instance, in Britain, we won the National Health Service, i.e. Health service for everyone, free at the point of use. But now the situation is completely different. For the last 30 years, and particularly since 2008, capitalism has been mired in a deep crisis from which it doesn't seem to be able to come out fully at any point. And this drives this relentless advance towards counter-reforms on the part of the capitalist class everywhere. And we have seen demands that were won maybe 100 years ago, rights that were conquered 50 years ago through struggle, are now being rolled back. This deregulation, outsourcing, subcontracting. Young workers are never put on the same contracts as workers who've been in these companies for longer, who won certain rights in the past. They have contracts which are worse, which have worse conditions and terms and so on. And this is creating a very explosive situation, because it's not just France that we've been talking about the strikes in France, but there's also been a wave of strikes in Britain. In Britain, where there hasn't been a proper wave of strikes, I don't know, since the 1980s. But now there's been hundreds of thousands of workers on strikes, including health workers, transport workers, civil servants, teachers, university lecturers, ambulance workers, you name it. They've all been on strike. For the main reason behind these strikes is the question of wages, because inflation's going up very fast. Wages are not keeping up. But then Monday last week, there was also a big strike in Germany, big warning strike by transport workers over the same issues. And I think that what's being prepared is a wave of an explosion of class struggle, where the workers, one country after another, are saying enough is enough. And we've been pushed back for decades. Now it's time to take back what belongs to us. And this can create situations like you just mentioned, situation we saw in Chile in 2019, in Ecuador, in Colombia. Mass national strikes can start to develop also in advanced capitalist countries, where workers are starting to flex their muscles after a long period of inaction.
And the fact that our wages have been stagnant since the 1970s, and that the cost of living is going up, is indicative of that war against the workers. It's indicative against, how we are constantly being made even more frail and, fragile in our own ability to sustain life. Can we talk about the role of banks? Because there used to be a time when the measurement was not just some elusive numbers, of sustained by nothing, and that's what we see today with the banking system, with several banks now collapsing. How does this correlate, and how does it affect the wealth that we are being deprived of?
Yes, I think it's quite interesting. In the last few weeks, we've seen a number of banks collapse. At the beginning, it was they said it's just a regional bank in the United States, which is not very big, the Silicon Valley Bank. Then it was First Republic, and then a few other banks. And then finally, the crisis hit Credit Suisse. And Credit Suisse is not a small regional bank. It's a bank that's considered to be part of systemic for the world financial system. So this is a big bank. Now, what's the reason why these banks are collapsing? Those people are trying to find all sorts of explanations. Well, Silicon Valley was heavily exposed to tech startup companies that are now in difficulties. Or Credit Suisse had a lot of problems already last year, scandals about funding, holding money for arms dealers and stuff like that. And yeah, it's true. These are the accidents that provoke the collapse of these banks. But in reality, I think that what's behind this, it reveals some more deep-rooted problems of the banking system, which are caused or revealed by the rise in interest rates. This is a bit complicated, but after the last big capitalist crisis in 2008, which expressed itself or started as a financial crisis, but it was really a crisis of capitalism. The banks were forced by the regulators. They said, we have learned the lessons. This is not going to happen again. There's not going to be another bailout, and there's not going to be another banking crisis. So therefore, in order to prevent that, we're going to force the banks to keep more of their assets in safe deposits, and they force them to purchase government bonds. Now, if you remember, at that time, government bonds, the national debt was very cheap. You will buy U.S. Treasury bonds, and they will give you 0% interest rate, or perhaps 1%. But it was a safe place to keep your money. You knew that it was very unlikely the U.S. Treasury was going to go under, was going to become bankrupt. And so after 5 years or 2 years or 3 years, whatever the maturity of your bond, you will get your money back, and that will be safe. But the problem is now that interest rates are no longer 1%, but they are 5%, 5.5, 6%. And so if these banks, like the Silicon Valley Bank, has a lot of money in bonds that are only giving you 0%, and then all of a sudden it needs liquidity, i.e. people are asking for the money back, and the bank needs to sell these bonds, but these bonds are now worth nothing. If they paid 100 for them, they can only sell them at a heavy discount because people don't want to buy bonds that only give you 0%, when they can buy bonds, current bonds, that give you 5 or 6%. So this is the problem. By rising interest rates, create all this instability in the financial system. What the central bankers are doing in reality is that they say, in order to control inflation, we need to provoke a recession. And it doesn't matter to them that millions of workers are going to lose their job if there's a serious recession. What they're interested in is the targets. The target is to bring inflation down to 2%, regardless of the consequences. And now we start to see the consequences, because a crisis in the banks is not just a crisis in the banks. The banks hold people's money. The banks lend money to businesses. Businesses then invest. If there's no lending, there's no investment, there's no jobs, and companies in the real world, not in the banking world, gonna have difficulties. People are going to be sacked from the jobs, and this is really accelerating a recession that was already coming. Now, there is a difference between now and 2008. At that time, the government intervened and bailed out the banks. Now they're trying to pretend that they're not bailing out the banks. I mean, you saw Biden on television saying, well, if you invest your money in a company, you risk your money, and this is how capitalism works. If you lose your money, you're a shareholder in Silicon Valley, you lost your money. But in reality, it's not so, because even though there isn't a bank bailout openly, there is a behind the curtains bank bailout. For instance, take Credit Suisse. This is a big bank. It's now been purchased or bought over by UBS, which is another big Swiss bank. But UBS said, we're only going to take this bank, which has a lot of difficulties, if the state guarantees the deposits. So the state said, okay, we're going to guarantee liquidity for this bank to the tune of 100 billion Swiss francs, something like this. So a lot of money from the taxpayers, again, is being put up in order to save the bankers. The bankers were quite happy, merrily investing the money here and there, risking everyone's livelihoods. When something goes wrong, then the state has to intervene. And who's the state? The state is all of us who pay our taxes, and then we're going to have to pay for this with austerity cuts. They're going to tell us, oh, there's no money for pensions, for instance. This is what Macron is saying in France. This pensions reform is going to save the state coffers so much money because we haven't got it. And why don't they have it? Well, I mean, they're spending a lot of money in the war in Ukraine, for instance, or they're spending a lot of money in tax cuts for the rich, subsidies for the big companies, including, this is another scam that's going on now, including the green, how you call it, the green transition tax subsidies. So basically, they're giving money to companies. Companies have been polluting the world for many years. Now they're going to be paid to transition to the green economy. At the end of the day, the companies are going to make a lot of money from this. And companies in these sectors are going to make a lot of money. So the ones who lose, as always in the class struggle, in the class war, is the workers. The workers, as you say, unless we organize and unite, we act in unison, then we're going to be under attack, and we're going to have to pay for these bank bailouts. And this is just the beginning, really. It's two banks, Credit Suisse, Silicon Valley Bank, and a couple of others. This is just the beginning. This is, let's say, the weakest link in the chain, but others will follow sooner or later. Let's remember, the banking crisis in 2008 didn't start at the core of the economy. It started by some small banks, Northern Rock, but then after a few months it was Lehman Brothers, and then some bigger banks went under. I think the same thing is going to happen this time. And again, we're going to be asked to pay for this. If you remember, after 2008, there was a massive wave of austerity cuts everywhere. And cuts in social spending, cuts in pension spending, cuts in healthcare, cuts in education, everything, as you said before, everything that the workers have won over 100 years of hard struggle is being taken away from us. I think that's the real meaning of this banking crisis, the first tremors of a much bigger economic recession that's coming.
I also feel that this idea of creating a mass inflation, has already been discredited long ago. We already, Keynesian, economists said that, you do not raise interest rates during a recession. You actually need to spend so that you can recover. And then when you're booming, then you save away, right? Then you can do those things. The reason why we see these kinds of violence against workers, I feel it's not because governments are stupid or they don't understand that or they don't know, but as capitalism is, literally demonstrating it's dying, right? This is a system that is dying. It needs to die away, and something new needs to replace it. It cannot be sustained. It cannot be sustained without massive loss, of life, and that's what we see. This constant fear that we have to sustain the system at all costs. Whether it be by creating wars abroad that destruct the population, that the United States is in terrible debt right now, and that their banks are failing, that their workers are not doing well, that the health of the country is not doing well. So I feel that as workers, we need to wake up. The violence is coming at us from different directions, and the only way we can immunize is by being together.
Yes, and this is part of the equation, what you just said. On top of this, you have to add the climate crisis. So capitalism is not only making life impossible for millions of workers, peasants around the world, but it's also threatening the very existence of life on Earth, because this is a predatory system that doesn't doesn't care about what they call externalities, i.e. the consequences of their actions. The only thing they care is the production for maximization of profit in the short term, regardless of the consequences, even if the consequences is polluting the earth to a point where life will become impossible.
And you can see that with, their idea of, on one hand, talking about climate change, on the other hand, sending bombs with depleted uranium and.
That's right, yeah.
So what inspires you amidst all this? What inspires you that we, the workers, can create a different way forward and a system that invites us all in, that it doesn't just create, wealth for a very few and leaves everybody else to fend for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, this is the case. The workers create all wealth. And the problem here is that this system has already outlived its usefulness from a general historical point of view. Capitalism has always been exploitative. And as Marx said, capitalism came to the wall, dripping blood and dirt from every pore. I mean, capitalism, primitive accumulation of capital was based on slavery, the slave trade, the spoliation and looting, destruction of Latin America and other continents. The capitalist system today is completely rotten. It prevents the development of science and technique, and it condemns the majority of the population to increasing poverty, while wealth is concentrated more and more at the top. This system is completely rotten and needs to be overthrown. And a class exists, the working class, that can carry out that. I mean, sometimes people say, "Oh, look, there's too many people on Earth. We can't feed everyone." This is not true. I mean, the World Food Organization has calculated that with the existing agriculture, you could feed the whole of the world's population twice over. I mean, we can discuss, obviously, the methods of agriculture that are being used under capitalism are completely wrong because they are destroying the environment. But let's ignore that just for 1 second and say the fact is that we could feed everyone. So why is people going hungry? Why are tens of thousands of children dying every year of malnutrition? It's only because of the profit system. The workers are perfectly capable creating a much better world, a world which will also mean, if you start by sharing out the work there is, you could reduce the working week to 4 days, 6 hours a day. You could bring down the retirement age, not push it back, and you will still be able to have a world of plenty for everyone, just on the basis of replacing the private profit motive and the anarchy of capitalism for a democratic planned economy based on the needs of the majority. And this is perfectly possible today. And I think that strikes like the French strike movement or the Colombian national strike that you mentioned, the huge movement of the Chilean workers and youth, the recent movement in Peru, this shows that ordinary working people, when they put their minds to it, they can change society. This is not easy, and it's a struggle. The ruling class will never give up the position of power and privilege without a struggle.
So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Take care. Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com.